How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the next video. As you can see by the title, today we're going to be talking about the ROI on data in manufacturing. And the reason for this video is I have been reading a lot of information and articles and posts on LinkedIn around this very topic, and it seems to me that a lot of the information or the basically the basis of the information is a little bit wrong, because usually it comes from vendors of a specific technology, whether that's hardware or software, and they simply fail to consider as to why the companies or the end users and or manufacturers are not getting the ROI they are promised at the beginning of some of those projects. Thank you so much for watching our channel. If you have a moment, I would truly appreciate if you could subscribe and like the video. If you could also leave me a comment as to whether the content is interesting for you, or if you would like to see something else in manufacturing industrial automation. It helps us tailor some of the future videos. I will also mention that we have a ton of different tutorials and articles that go way beyond the content on the joltech.com website. If you need help on some of your projects, don't hesitate to reach out. With that in mind, let's get back to the video. And so, having done a lot of that work across different verticals or industries, specifically food and beverage, CPG, pharma, or medical devices, I believe to have a slightly different perspective. And so my goal is always to simplify things as much as possible. As I age, I do have an appreciation for keeping things as simple as possible. So I like to break this down into people, process, and technologies. And this is a rather simple framework to think about some of the different challenges as well as opportunities when it comes to a specific manufacturer, but you can obviously apply any other framework that you would like to basically figure out what the readiness of your facility or your entire organization is when it comes to using data for decision making. And so when we start with the people component, right, there is always the opportunity to understand where the organization stands from the personnel standpoint versus what is being presented by the vendor. And so a lot of times I feel that in our industry, you're going to be led to believe that simply because a solution has worked in one specific organization, it can simply be taken and reapplied to your specific manufacturing facility. And so again, this highly depends, of course, on the vertical, but usually the vertical not only dictates what kind of profit margins you're running, what kind of maybe vendors you're working with, but also what kind of people you have on the plant floor. And to illustrate this example, let's take two extremes, right? So on one side, let's say you have the SpaceX or you have your Tesla, versus in the other side, you have some of the food and beverage facilities, right? And I have worked at Kraft Heinz, so KHC, maybe you have your Tyson Foods, you have your General Mills, right? And so the list goes on. But ultimately, the point that I want to make here in the people column is put yourself in the shoes of a highly technical, highly advanced and cutting edge facility like SpaceX or Tesla that has been a greenfield facility as of early 2010 versus some of the other facilities in the food and beverage space that have been around for many decades, meaning that they have a lot of technical debt. And this ties into not only the technology side, but also the kind of people that are usually going to be working on the plant floors. Now, that's not to be said that there aren't going to be exceptions, that there aren't going to be basically facilities where you will have cutting edge teams that are driving continuous improvement, that are looking at data. Maybe you have data scientists, but the reality is that companies like SpaceX and Tesla are going to attract many more engineers and highly skilled operators than some of the other food and beverage facilities. So ultimately, to bring this back to the ROI on data, well, again, you can see a couple of different extremes. On one side, you have companies that have embedded SCADA and MES solutions where they're trying to optimize on that 0.1 or 0.01% OE that is worth millions for the organization and sometimes billions based on productivity, and they have been using the data tools for many years, if not decades. Well, obviously in this case it's going to be a decade in essence. But other organizations like Kraft Heinz, Tyson Foods, General Mills, they're not going to be as advanced on the data analytics component. And a lot of times the people on the floor, again, obviously it depends on the site, will have means of surveying the data and the information and understanding the process a lot more simpler than what you're used to seeing on the data side. So they will have charts, they will have paper, they will still have whiteboards where they will list different components. So going back to the main point of ROI on data in manufacturing, if you're seeking to improve data in both of those organizations and you're going to use the Tesla or SpaceX as the benchmark, it simply will not work for a lot of the facilities in the food and beverage space because they do not have the people with the knowledge, experience required to drive the ROI based on the tools that they might get through the digital transformation initiatives. On the process side, the same thing can be, again, explained and basically described. What I've seen a lot of times is as the organization matures, there's going to be a lot of processes on the business as well as personnel side that will dictate how certain processes are executed, right? So I'll give you an example. I worked very extensively on the P&G side, on the OQ, IQ, and PQ processes because I've commissioned a lot of different equipment and lines. And so ultimately these processes dictate how do we qualify a new specific line within an FDA, or in this case, medical device regulated facility. And of course, as we started the process, we would have access to a lot of different data that would then allow us to shorten the time it took to deploy that specific line, validate different components of the equipment, and ultimately accelerate new line deployment and commissioning within a specific site. Well, again, put yourself in the shoes of a smaller manufacturer that has none of the documentation, and basically any data that will be collected will simply go to waste because there are no predefined processes. It's more about local teams executing a certain sequence of steps that will dictate how they commission the line. So commissioning is done basically on a custom basis, and there has been no precedent of using data for that specific process. And that is just one example of a process within a business that can lend itself to optimization should the team be capable of using data for that optimization. And so in this case, once again, we are looking at a process, one example of which can be optimized with data, and then for a different facility, that process is simply not mature enough to be able to understand where the opportunity lies. Now, technologies is a very important question, right? And so I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but sometimes it is common to walk onto the plant floor and see very manual data logging processes in place. I've mentioned a couple of them, and I still see them in many manufacturers. So I'll give you an example. There's going to be a chart, which is basically a plot of hours, right? So imagine that this is 7 a.m., this is going to be 8 a.m., this is 9, so on and so forth. And the operator will look at the number of pallets or cases, depending on the product, and simply, for example, this is going to be the count. So here it's 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and they're going to plot this as, let's say this is 350, next hour we made 200, this hour we made 300, and so on and so forth, and they will get a decent average of what the process has been during that specific shift. Well, again, do they have the right technology in place to give them the information they need? For that specific operator, that could be very sufficient. They can basically look at the number of pallets, report that back to their supervisor or their ops manager, and be good on that side. However, if I'm, for example, leading the maintenance efforts, or if I'm leading the CI efforts, and all I got to go on is this chart of how well we've done, well, I have absolutely no idea as to why there was this dip at 8 a.m. And of course, you can say, well, the operator maybe is able to articulate the problems, right? So let's assume that at 8 a.m., the shrink wrapper was down. right? And they can give you that piece of information for that specific productivity loss, but ultimately the data becomes completely unreliable. You're starting to see patterns where different individuals are going to have different stories. Maybe on the night shift, they're running slightly better because they've tweaked certain parameters. And the question that you should be asking yourself is, do we truly understand what the problem was based on the technical solution that we have in place? And the answer for many facilities is quite simply no. I have walked into production plants where 40,000 pounds of product were quite simply dumped because of a quality control issue. And when the question was brought up as to why that has happened over the, for example, in the night shift, they cooked a batch and they realized at the end of the process, they took a sample into the quality control lab. It failed. They had to dump the entire batch. Why did this happen? Well, they couldn't answer the question, again, because they had the instrumentation in place. The instrumentation performs the cooking process. It reaches a certain temperature upon which the process moves on to the next kettle, but they had none of those logs and they hadn't realized that the temperature sensor had actually failed to record the right temperature before you could send the batch to the next process, because they lacked the technology or the instrumentation to understand why this issue had truly happened. And there's tons of examples, again, from my previous experience, where we've deployed a solution to allow you to log some of that information either locally or in a distributed environment so that you could access and understand better what's going on with the process, so that you can then understand where the issues were. You can have better conversations with your team, and ultimately, and this is a whole other conversation, start to think, understand, and eliminate bottlenecks, right? And so really briefly, if you have a process of multiple machines, specifically if you have in food and bev, if you have batching processes, usually you have different stages, at which point you have a filler machine or some kind of a packaging machine that goes from process to discrete, which is in many times going to be the bottleneck, but not necessarily, depending on what the data shows, at which point you have a packaging process. And so if you cannot articulate where the bottleneck for your production is, it becomes very difficult to allocate capital. It becomes very difficult to allocate capital. It becomes very difficult to allocate resources, whether it's on the engineering, maintenance, or operational side. And ultimately, you're basically fighting fires all over the place because you simply do not have the right tools or the right technologies to extract, store, and present specific data points. If you have any questions on either one of these, I could talk about them for many, many different hours on the people side, on the process side, as well as the technology side. Don't hesitate to reach out. Always happy to help. Always happy to have a conversation around manufacturing, industrial automation, and of course, industrial data.